From the producer of the new Star Wars trilogy, the writer of The Martian, and the director of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, 2008's Cloverfield is one of the most underappreciated movies of the past 20 years and absolutely one of my favorites. It has the stunning visuals and unmatched CGI of a blockbuster and mixes it with the experimental yet compelling storytelling of an indie thriller. However, it is still a movie that, despite being a box office smash, having nearly septupled its budget in the 2008 box office, making it $172.4 million, I have heard very little discussion about it in the general movie-going community. Now, it's not like Cloverfield is critically condemned. In fact, it was really well received with a respectable 77% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 7 out of 10 on IMDb. Even Pulitzer Prize winning film critic Roger Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars, putting it above classics such as The Usual Suspects and A Clockwork Orange. Nevertheless, Cloverfield is not as talked about as movies such as 1954's Godzilla, 1982's The Thing, or even its counterpart 2006's The Host. Now, I don't exactly want to get into why people don't really talk about this because I'm not a psychologist, but rather I want to share with you guys the 3 things that I think makes Cloverfield one of the greatest movies about a monster ever made.
I think they got him! Yeah, that's the shit right there! That's what I'm talking.
The cliche for when people talk about Cloverfield is that it is the Blair Witch Project meets Godzilla. And I am definitely not here to dispute that claim because it is really accurate, as I'm going to elaborate on later in this. And just like I said, rather than that, I'm going to use this as the basis for my first 2 characteristics that make Cloverfield one hell of a movie. The first thing that we're going to cover is the genre that Godzilla brings to mind and how Cloverfield incorporated something new to it. Cloverfield is a monster movie, and there is no quarrel with that since there is literally a skyscraper-sized monster roaming Manhattan. But an aspect of the film that is often overlooked is its place as an apocalyptic film. Right around the time that Cloverfield came out is what I like to call Apocalypse New. Pretty much since the release of Planet of the Apes and Mad Max in the late 60s and 70s, Hollywood has been popping out a few apocalyptic movies each year, and the 2000s took that phenomenon to a new level. Truly starting in 1996 with the release of Independence Day, we have seen disaster movie after disaster movie in which we have been forced to watch our world become no more. From the absolutely hilarious Shaun of the Dead to the eerily accurate Contagion, Apocalypse New has dominated the film industry, and Cloverfield took advantage of this craze. Purely speaking from a cinematic perspective, I think that Cloverfield is the second best movie with a monster in it from the past century, mainly because the monster movie as we know it has become outdated. Aside from Bong Joon-ho's The Host, which Cloverfield definitely takes inspiration from, monster movies have become more generic and therefore much more boring. However, the decision to use the contained yet stunning set pieces in Manhattan to create an isolated disaster movie with a monster subplot works to Cloverfield's advantage. Now, this probably seems obvious. Yeah, but aren't all monster movies apocalyptic? Well, kind of. Monster movies serve as a sort of subgenre at times, but the entire concept of a monster is inherently contained to an isolated incident, which in one way or another gets out of hand. Take Frankenstein's monster or The Fly, for example. Whether successful or failed, some sort of experimentation or tampering leads to an unexpected event that humans simply cannot control. Here, we have no idea where the Cloverfield monster is from. If we were viewing this from another character's perspective, possibly a military figure, then we could say that this is a full-on monster movie that happens to have a lot of destruction occur along the way. And while the inciting incident in Cloverfield is this humongous monster, it was never in the control of our main characters. Matter of fact, they never even attempt to interact with the monster, rather fleeing for their lives as we often see in disaster movies. In all actuality, a good chunk of this movie is the gang at a party, and they're the ones disrupted by this sudden event that causes substantial catastrophe, extreme damage, and irredeemable loss, aka a disaster. So, Now that we've established that Cloverfield is both a monster movie and a disaster movie, relying much more heavily on the latter subject, how does it execute both of these facets of entertainment? Before I get into how the characters and the story itself is executed in Cloverfield, I'm gonna issue a full-on spoiler warning. So, if you haven't seen Cloverfield yet, skip to this timestamp. Last warning, skip to here. First and foremost, what makes this story so compelling is that the characters have a clear sense of urgency and a very clear obstacle. The former being Robert's love interest Beth, and the latter obviously being the Cloverfield monster. Now, one of the reasons why I don't feel comfortable saying that this is the best or even a top 3 monster movie ever is that Cloverfield has nothing amazing when it comes to the story. It is pretty straightforward for the most part. However, I do think that the ballsiness of the story makes it stand out a bit. Unlike other blockbuster franchises such as the MCU and even individual disaster films such as San Andreas in 2012, Cloverfield does not fear killing off its characters. In fact, all of the characters die in this story at one point or another. This decision adds on to the realism of the film, as we don't see any characters go through some crazy obstacle course of death just to survive at the end. Pretty sure The Rock is the only person that can convincingly pull that off, to be truthful. More likely than not though, an isolated disaster will end up like Cloverfield does, not how San Andreas does. So, when it comes to the execution and the plot, I think that Cloverfield delivers quite well. Once again, there is nothing mind-blowing here on the screenwriting level, but it is a really viable story that is elevated by its ballsiness and the following factor. Now, it is no secret that when it comes to both the genre of disaster and the genre of monster movies, something that is really important is how the movie looks. Disaster movies are out here blowing up entire cities, and monster movies are tearing apart skyscrapers. So, how does Cloverfield fare in making these ghastly occurrences come to life? Well, they do quite well. Rewatching the movie 10 years later, it is hard not to be impressed with the seamless blend of visual effects and on-location shooting. Compared to the CGI in The Host, a movie made less than 2 years prior to Cloverfield and with $15 million more to work with, we can see how much of a difference the visual aesthetic makes, especially when we are all accustomed to seeing fully digitally enhanced imagery in places where we don't even expect it. As Germain Lussier states, this makes the whole film feel as expansive as a Marvel movie with a $250 million budget when it truly has about $25 million, and it is mind-blowing that they were able to pull it off so believably. All in all, Cloverfield is most often brought up as a monster movie when that is truly about 30% of it. Of course, the monster is an imposing figure that leaves its mark, but the fact that many people overlook the film's place as an all-time great disaster story leads to a limited perspective on the film as a whole.
Everybody hang on!
Then why don't you just fucking die already? Just give up and die. Why don't you just die already? Just die.
Now for the second thing, let's look at the Blair Witch Project part of this comparison, the cinematography. Based off of some audience reviews on the interwebs, I think that it is safe to say that the cinematography is either the most or the second most, I'll get more into that later, divisive thing about this movie. I can understand those who say that the decision to make this entire movie handheld and from one point of view left you disoriented and wanting more, but I counter with this. That is the gosh darn point. By no means is this an original idea, hence the reason why this is stemming from the Blair Witch Project. But just like it did with the genre, Cloverfield expanded on the original concept. Through the handheld cinematography, the film limits our point of view, and this might not seem like a good thing at first, but in the case of a disaster movie masquerading as a monster movie that takes place in real-world Manhattan, this decision escalates the tension drastically. When we're looking at an extreme long shot of a plane flying away from rubble, there is a sense of awe to it. We are astonished by what's happening, but we also know that the characters are gonna be completely fine. But all you can see is the ground, and all you hear is panting and panic. Then you're confused and you're scared shitless, just like the characters in Cloverfield are. So this limited perspective that we're giving unexpectedly makes us feel even more immersed in the story. In any movie, we only know as much as the camera is willing to tell us, and here a lot is left up to the imagination. In his book The End of Celluloid, Matt Henson highlights horror as a genre which has benefited from limited perspective viewings, as he states that in modern horror, what is unsaid or only glimpsed at is much more effective than the overstimulation of the imagery. Cloverfield is both a monster movie and a disaster movie, and both of these tragedies require and relay a sense of fear and horror onto the audience. By leaving so much uncertainty in the story, the film creates an immediacy in the atmosphere that in many ways is more subtle and unsettling than these earlier gorefests that Henson is referring to. Secondly, the more personal recording method establishes and reinforces our direct connection with the characters' experiences. Take the subway scene for example. After being forced to travel through a dark underground tunnel, the four friends hear something. But wait, they can't see what it is, and neither can we, so we just keep on moving. The only source of light that we have is, guess what? The camera's flashlight, which narrows down the frame even more than before. We pan down to see a herd of rats running away, and we begin to speed up. Then, we hear a hissing sound, and as white people in scary movies tend to do, we decide to figure out what's happening. The entire time, the camera prohibits us from knowing what is truly going on. Imagine if this was shot in a wide frame with natural lighting. If we were to see these creatures beforehand, then we have just lost a lot of suspense. Suspense is not about the occurrence of an action, but rather how you get there. So, the fact that we are here, being incorporated into the story by the choices in the cinematography and being given limited information for the same reasons, the suspense is exacerbated as we walk with the characters for 10 minutes until... Before we move on, let's look at another example. 2 scenes after the subway chase in which Marlena got bit by a strange creature, they run into the army. This is the first outside human contact that the characters have had in a few hours, and they are given a sense of hope and wonderment. As they proceed down the emergency station, Jason pleads for the military's help, and for about 2.5 minutes, the camera is focused on this interaction and away from Marlena until she calls to HUD and says,
I don't feel so good.
Then we see her being taken away by the doctors and soldiers until all of a sudden... Here, the shaky first-person point of view works to create an unwanted sense of entrapment while also implanting the idea of avoidability in our minds. As any normal human would do, HUD, who is controlling the camera the entire time, turns away and once again limits our perspective. In addition to these 2 qualities, the camera work and the decision to turn away at certain points makes us a character in the story. As any great cinematographer would say, the camera must serve as a character of its own, incorporating thematic elements and subtly conveying power dynamics. For example, the camera in Rashomon similarly is a metaphor for us. The 1950 film is a courtroom drama without a judge, and rather we are the ones being asked if we trust what is being told to us. Many movies would take this gruesome shot, and while I'm not necessarily saying this is the worst of ideas, a lot of movies would hold on to this singular frame. But that just isn't realistic, and it is focusing on the wrong thing. As the audience, once we have a semblance of what is occurring, the action itself is no longer important. At that point, the reactions are essential. Seeing the camera pretty much flee the scene and witnessing HUD and Jason nearly break down is what we would be seeing at this moment. And Cloverfield does that just right. Simply put, if we were in this room and we saw a girl or a guy blowing up, I don't think we would stare at it. This might be because I'm not a lunatic, but I will turn away, and by doing this, the camera work gives the film itself a more humanistic and grounding quality, a factor that a lot of these larger-than-life CGI monstrosities tend to lack. To be truthful, I don't think that I can say it much better than Riley Richter. This limited viewing technique of filming forces us to use our senses in order to follow what is going on. In effect, the audience is forced to feel the suspense and the terror that the characters are going through. Now that we've established that the camera is a character of its own, I want to argue that in many ways it serves as a motif for survival, as those who let go of the camera go on to die some pretty gruesome deaths. And the camera is literally the only thing that survives this disaster, as we are told in the very beginning that this is all found footage owned by the government. So while we are on the note of the realism of the cinematography, I think that this video essay, while probably really long, is incomplete without me talking about the historical parallels that the cinematography evokes with an event that took place just a few years before the release of Cloverfield, 9/11. I've talked a bit about Apocalypse Now in the state of mainstream film in the late 2000s, and already, as you guys know, film is one of the greatest barometers that we have of society and where we are politically, culturally, mentally. We can look back to how film reflected fear of nuclear war in the 50s and 60s, or even to how cinema portrayed the mundane lives of middle-class men in the 90s. In the 2000s, the topic of fear in the United States was destruction and terrorism, and I think that there's no debate that the camera work in Cloverfield and the destruction that occurs in freaking Manhattan eerily parallels the carnage in 9/11. The baggage of the event was definitely looming over the film, as some of the first lines of dialogue we hear following the blockout is whether it is terrorists. Going even further, a lot of the street footage has the documentarian realism that is rarely found in films. Even Borat, a movie that I absolutely adore, can feel too cinematic and grounded at times. Here though, the purposeful amateur camera work is never abandoned and plays to the film's strengths. Now, one of the reasons as to why the Blair Witch Project was so popular is because a lot of people genuinely did not know if it was real. While I'm not gonna say Cloverfield necessarily borders that hyper-realistic line, it definitely does well for a disaster movie.
Man, what is going on? Maybe you should have left town a little bit earlier, right? Should have. Oh, shit. Go, 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 go!
Now, I have talked a lot about the camera work in Cloverfield, but cinematography is so much more than a few dollies and zooms here and there. Cinematography has a lot to do with the lighting, which is fairly plain here as low-key is implemented to make rendering easier for the VFX team, and to create an overall eerie ambiance. But what I want to highlight even more than that is the use of color. Specifically, the juxtaposition of a predominantly orange overtone in times of distress and the blue atmosphere when there are hints of hope. Most vividly opposing themselves in the initial attack scene, we see orange ash overtake the screen as the people are vulnerable outside. Once they move inside the store, however, a blue shade overtakes the screen as the color denotes a more calming atmosphere. This use of colors is in no way new, as almost nothing in film nowadays can be new. Take David Fincher, for example, who absolutely loves to use these bland, yet purposeful, colors in his films. And in Cloverfield, the use of orange and blue enhances a sense of danger that is briefly interjected by small spurts of safety. Overall, I find that the cinematography in Cloverfield, while nothing revolutionary or even Oscar-worthy, is very purposeful, ambitious, and realistic. Nonetheless, these decisions were, and in many cases are, very, very risky. A lot of reviews that I stumbled upon openly say that they left the movie disoriented, and the way that it was shot undoubtedly has a lot to do with that. And I definitely do not advocate for that, because cinematography should be subtle. As Roger Deakins stated, the cinematography is best when nobody can tell that it's even there, because it is perfectly blended in with the remaining elements of film. Nevertheless, every single time I return to Cloverfield, it works for me. I find the camera work to be pretty inspiring and definitely motivated. The length of this movie goes hand in hand with the ballsiness of the characters and the story that I talked about earlier. This movie is 1 hour and 24 minutes long. And given that 11 of those minutes are some of the greatest credits of all time, and the first 20 minutes is just a party, we only get about 50 minutes of monstering in this. And at a time when 2-hour plus movies are becoming the norm, With 3 of the biggest movies of all time being around 3 hours long, it is refreshing to see a film which trims all of that excessive fat right down. For 20 minutes, we live with these characters. We got comfortable with their personalities and their motivations. Then the movie transitions from Dazed and Confused to 2012 while maintaining its grip hold on the audience's attention. For context, I went ahead and averaged out the runtimes of WatchMojo's top 20 movies of the first 20 years of the 21st century. Now try saying that 10 times fast. So, after averaging out all of these guys, a list that actually includes Cloverfield at number 2, we reach an average of 113.5 minutes a movie, a number that is 23.5 minutes longer than Cloverfield's 90-minute runtime. In that amount of time, I could watch an entire episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and probably get the same amount of enjoyment out of it. Now, this average is a bit weighted as Peter Jackson made one of those films. So, taking out 2005's King Kong, the average is still 108.5 minutes, a good 18.5 minutes more than Cloverfield's full runtime. And in all actuality, Cloverfield's runtime is more like 78 minutes, so we're being nice here. While this is certainly not the only reason for the film's enjoyability, hence the 2 other reasons that I kind of just talked for, like 20 minutes, but the length does give the leeway to one of the film's most important aspects, its ambiguity. A recurrent theme throughout a lot of this really hefty video essay is that Cloverfield leaves a lot to the imagination. Being the brainchild of one J.J. Abrams, that explains a lot. Now, rather than adding on to this pretty hefty video essay, I'm going to go ahead and direct you to J.J. Abrams' TED Talk, in which he talks about his mystery box and why ambiguity is so important. Guys, I know you've been waiting for this. I know it. Now wait for it, guys. Just wait for it, okay? Just wait for it, okay? In conclusion, Cloverfield is a movie that knows what it is. It gives homage to the films such as Planet of the Apes with the head of the Statue of Liberty and King Kong with the consistent speak of Japan, but it also is a movie that has realism and so many humanistic qualities to it. At a time when movies feel more and more manufactured, Cloverfield is a sci-fi blockbuster that feels like it is made by actual people. This is not a perfect story. This is not anything revolutionary, but it is well executed, aesthetically pleasing, and uses its ambiguity to craft an amazing monster movie and a terrifying disaster film, which ties into some pretty significant historical catastrophes. Of course, this is not a movie without any flaws, but then again, few things are. So for those pessimists out there, there are many points along the way which gleefully challenge our suspension of disbelief, which I'll go ahead and list here so you can read it if you want. If you don't, then don't. Now, Cloverfield has many things that makes it a great monster movie, possibly the greatest. But above all, it is the heart put into this cinematic piece of art that really makes it stand out.